So, we are in a time when newspapers have a vast amount of political influence and can even shape policy at wartime and can shape the results of elections in the country. Kind of crazy. So newspapers in the 1930s, what happens in this period? Obviously the 1930s is characterized by sort of the march to war and World War II. So you have a time of increasing international tensions, but the newspaper industry actually goes towards a different kind of route and tries to provide a very much an escapist route away from the reality of our times. So newspapers in general downplayed the threat of war, peddled a sort of naive optimism due to the circulation wars that they all found themselves in this period as well. The happier the content, the lighter the content, the more the newspaper sold. So very few newspapers were actually reporting on what was going on in Europe and how, you know, the inevitable march towards World War II was happening. So here's a quote from Kevin Williams. The mass of people sought reassurance in an age of fear, doubt and uncertainty. Newspapers remained upbeat to provide escapism for a country weighed down by difficulty. The British press in the 1930s sought to avoid challenging matters and provide images of the nation as stable, harmonious and happy. Basically, the British press in the 1930s is gaslighting the country. It's reporting that everything is fine, everything is happy, everything is great, at a time of incredible international tension. So it's a kind of unique approach, really. In Kevin's own analysis of this, so British newspapers of nearly all shades of opinion failed in their efforts to fully, frankly and fairly report the events of the interwar years, in particular the conditions of poverty and unemployment, the rise of fascism and the crisis in British institutions such as the abdication of 1936. So even like critically important events to the constitution of the country, like the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936, these almost get glossed over in the popular press. You know, there's not critical reporting of these, of what happened during this time, and in particular, sort of the poverty and we talked about this with regards to the radio, right? And looking at John Reith and how the BBC sort of glossed over the events of the general strike of 1926. As the Great Depression strikes in the early part of the 1930s, newspapers turn a blind eye to the struggles of the poor, to the mass poverty that engulfs the country and indeed engulfs the world as the world goes through the Great Depression of 1929 through to about 1933. And in doing so, what Williams is arguing is that basically through this gaslighting of the British population, it leaves the population unprepared for what's coming at the end of the 30s. The population is relatively naive when it comes to understanding what is going to happen, and that is a disservice to the entire population itself. So, concentrating on the abdication crisis of 1936, if we think about what the press did with the monarchy during that time, and it's not too dissimilar to what it is today, although the Meghan Markle debacle of the last few months actually does show some kind of changes in how the press react towards royalty. Basically, the press in the 1930s has an adulation, a fawning attitude towards the royal family. This is part of the deliberate attempts to try and avoid real problems in the world. So lots of royal news, lots of royal coverage, lots of deferential coverage of the royals. And this led to deferential coverage of the abdication crisis. So when there's the abdication, there's no critical reflection on Edward VIII, there's no critical reflection on the monarchy as an institution, there's no critical reflection on the constitutional crisis that happens in 1936. It is much more touchy-feely, aren't the royals wonderful? So, well, you have things to talk about here, why aren't you talking about them? Hugely supportive of Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement towards Nazi Germany from 1937 to 1940. Basically, very, very mute in criticism of Nazi Germany during that time, and I'll come to what that means in a second. Very poor coverage of economic hardship in the 1930s. For example, the 1932, the National Hunger March, was widely reported as an attempt to destabilise Britain rather than an attempt for people to actually represent themselves and look for fairer conditions in the country. The press barons themselves and their relationship with politics during the 1930s is massively problematic. So many press barons were active Nazi sympathisers and supporters of fascism within Britain as well. Rothmere in the Daily Mail published a huge amount of pro-Nazi material, even went so far as to meet Hitler himself, and we've got the photo there, and congratulate him on the annexation of Czechoslovakia as well. So you have ennobled press barons on the side of fascists in the 1930s. This, my friends, is massively, massively problematic. And next time you ever see anything in the Daily Mail of, like, criticisms of anything, you just think back to when in the 1930s the Daily Mail was all about the Nazis, and just have a think about what kind of newspaper it actually is. Fortunately, at this time, despite having massive political power during the First World War and during the 1920s, by the 1930s, the press barons were starting to get excluded from politics, and thank God that was the case. Basically, their very radical right-wing politics, even fascist politics, was not particularly appealing to the British public in the 1930s, and any political ambitions failed at that time as well. It was like, from being part of the political establishment 10 to 15 years previously, the press barons were increasingly excluded. From the political establishment itself. So, even though those political views were excluded at this time, government still engaged very heavily with the press, but in an attempt to create a propaganda system in order to publicize, what the government was doing well, and in order to kind of lead public discussion and discourse on politics through the press. You'll be familiar with this in the context of PR. And what we really see in the 1930s is an emergence of public relations on the part of government, using skilled professionals, often from the journalistic profession, to engage with the press in order to get the message that the government wanted out there. So very sophisticated propaganda and news management help government convey a message of optimism. A completely false message of optimism in the 1930s, but nevertheless a message of optimism. So we see the emergence really of public relations and press officers in this time. So then World War II strikes. So the outbreak of World War II ended basically the competition in the press at that time. Papers actually became smaller due to paper rationing. Demand for news actually increased, of course, during this time. But radio had a much better war, as I've already discussed with radio. I kind of alluded towards that last week. Cinema also starts to show a lot of war coverage at this time as well. And indeed, censorship during the war means that the freedom of the press is absolutely curtailed during this time. So this combination of factors means that newspapers actually take a massive hit during World War II. Basically, the lack of paper means advertising revenue is going to go down, means sales are going to go down. There is demand, but competing mediums like the radio and cinema mean that they can actually muscle in on the press's dominance of news coverage at this time as well. And plus, censorship means that they've got actually probably less real news to give out as well. The situation continued in post-war period until 1955, when paper rationing finally ended in the UK. So, I mean, the war years and the period after the war were a really, really difficult period for the newspaper industry itself. You've limited production, limited advertising revenue, limited readership, and limited news. So from the glory years pre-World War II up to 1950, you know, a huge shock hits the industry. Further consolidation, fewer profits, less political influence. It's a big change. Even in 1955, when the newspapers start to re-emerge after the war, television starts to take off. So in 1953, and I'll come obviously to television in the next lecture that I record, but television takes off in 1953 as a new competitor for entertainment and human interest stories. ITV launches in 1955. Basically, that advertising model that the press so relied on pre-World War II takes a massive hit from the emergence of commercial television and television in general in 1953 as a competitor to the newspaper in terms of the attention of an audience. So during this period, coming out from the economic shock of World War II, you've got a new, hugely popular medium emerging in the television, and we see massive closures of the press. So the News Chronicle, the Daily Herald, the Daily Sketch, they go under. Lots of Sunday newspapers, lots of provincial newspapers start losing titles. It's carnage. Huge loss of advertising revenue thanks to television, huge loss of readership thanks to television, because television is a medium which speaks to people in a different way, and newspapers start to collapse left, right and centre. As Kevin says here in this quote, it's basically a numbers game which television hits in a very, very big way, and the viability of newspapers is affected accordingly. So you either go for a very high-end audience or a mass low-end audience. Anything in between just won't work. But in order to get that, you're only going to have a couple of newspapers that actually get that high-end audience. You're only going to get a couple of newspapers that get enough people at the low end in order to be financially viable. So you see a collapse of the industry and a massive contraction of the industry towards a few titles. We call this polarization. It's a period of prolonged decline for the newspaper industry. Larger papers survive, but Sundays, provincial presses, weekly presses all suffer, with a huge consolidation and polarization of the industry itself. And also, thanks perhaps to some of the incidents in the 1920s and before with regards to the validity of news coverage and political influence, you start to see the emergence of regulation. Now, it's hardly surprising that the next time the Labour government actually gets into power in the UK, just after the Second World War, so Clement Attlee's government of 1945 onwards, given the events of the 1920s with the Zinoviev letter, the Labour government of the mid part of the 1940s presses for regulation of the press. The Labour Party is sick to death of the press basically making up lies about them. So they set up a Royal Commission in 1947 to assess the role of the press in the country, because Labour's always been affected by press hostility and believed the press was biased against it and monopolised by Tory supporting owners. Again, does anything change? This is the circumstance that we find ourselves in today. Now, the report that was actually given by that commission was very muted in its criticism and largely advocated self-regulation for the press, leading to the formation of the first Press Council in 1953, which a body for regulation of the press to ensure sort of appropriate political coverage, but really with very little in the way of powers. No means to enforce any of the decisions. Basically, the press pretty much ignored anything that this body said. So the first attempts of regulation of the press and to try and bring the press under control kind of failed big time. But we do see radical changes in the 1950s with regards to ownership too. So the age of the interventionist and politically active press baron comes to an end at this period of time. It'll come back. It will return. But in the 1950s, you get a new set of proprietors like Lord Thompson, Roy Thompson, who owned the Times and Sunday Times, non-interventionist, ran the whole thing as a business. Less politically inclined and less inclined to use newspapers to express their political opinions, albeit these newspapers would still largely be conservative and right-wing. In the 50s as well, the pressure on the press that came from the emergence and the mass membership of trade unions was incredibly important. So the rise in trade union power in the 50s and 60s, at a time of economic boom and full employment at that time, post World War II, put unique pressures on the press. Basically, working in the newspaper industry became a unionized profession. If you weren't part of the union, this became a closed shop. You wouldn't get jobs in the newspaper industry. That goes for journalism, that goes for printing, that goes for distribution. And the power of the unions and power of consolidated and unified labour in the industry meant high staffing levels, very high pay for people working in it, and that put incredible economic pressures on newspapers as well. And partially the reason why newspapers collapsed in the 1960s is because the amount of, the costs of labour in the newspaper industry also became too much to bear. Those unions as well were incredibly resistant to any kinds of new technology that might make the production of newspapers more efficient. And into the 1960s, what we're talking about here really is the emergence of digital media and computers. You start to see the first, and Reese will do this lecture with you in a short while, but you start to see the emergence of computer technology in the 1960s, and computation will eventually transform the newspaper industry beyond recognition. There was huge resistance to the emergence of any kind of computation in the newspaper industry in the 1960s and the 1970s, and the unions and their power at that time meant that they could effectively block out any kind of revolutionary change in the production methods that newspapers had in that time. So, how does the industry react to all these problems? So, the modern tabloid, that emerges in the 1970s, change in size, values, content, and production methods. The key moment in this was the Australian businessman Rupert Murdoch buying The Sun. Now, The Sun, according to Kevin Williams, dominated the market for the next 20 years after Murdoch purchases it. Achieved this by pushing the newspaper's contest relentlessly down market and by a combination of brilliant marketing and innovative layout. It was assisted by several other factors too. Changes in the ownership of its major competitors, which made them less responsive, the economic problems of the 70s, which had a profound effect on society and the newspaper business, and the capacity of the Sun to tune into changes in British society that brought Margaret Thatcher to power in 1979 was also very, very significant. What did the Sun force others to do? Forced the Daily Mirror to compete. Daily Mail went tabloid in 1971, so did the Express in 77. The Daily Star launched as an illustrated rip-off of the Sun in 1978, so leaving their 5 national tabloids in a new circulation war. The Sun and its success forced other newspapers to transform. It forced newspapers to copy its style, its size, and its kind of content as well. So let's get some more detail on the Sun. So the Sun was launched in 1964 to replace the Daily Herald, which closed in 1964. It was very, very unsuccessful until Rupert Murdoch bought it, and was launched as a tabloid in 1969 under Larry Lamb. Excuse me. Very much a first at this time, following on from the sort of cultural revolution in the United Kingdom in the 1960s, we see the emergence of an affluent, younger generation of people. This newspaper was targeted directly at that generation, very much looking at young people and the interest that young people would have. So you get a newspaper focused on aspiration, leisure, consumption, show business, sport, etc. Those are the primary focuses of the newspaper, whereas other newspapers are not tapping into that demographic and that market in the same way. And what did the Sun do to sell as much as possible? Of course, sex. As much sex as it could possibly put in the newspaper. So on November the 17th, 1970, the first page 3 girl and the first page 3 spread was in the Sun. That became a staple of the newspaper for many, many years afterwards. But also just the tone and the style of content in the Sun is very sex-oriented as well. So At that time, the Mirror, competitor to the Sun, very, very old-fashioned, unable to follow the youth culture and unwilling to follow down market. Those things put the newspaper in big, big trouble. So Mirror Group newspapers get reorganized in the 1970s, but the Mirror Group won't slide down market until Robert Maxwell would buy the newspapers in 1984. Basically, you have a competition in the tabloid industry between the relentless, cheery optimism, right-wing politics, and sex of the Sun against more traditional newspapers, and the Sun wipes the floor with them. The Sun becomes the newspaper of choice during the 70s and 80s. On the other end of the market, after this polarization between down-market newspapers and up-market newspapers, at that quality press end, the broadship market really does hold up as a valuable readership until the 1980s. Again, Murdoch sees this and intervenes. He buys the Times and the Sunday Times in 1981. He still owns those newspapers. But these newspapers are targeting, they're not going for the same kind of circulation. They're targeting a different kind of readership, and their advertising profile is different accordingly. So, in the context of the times that all of this is occurring in, it's important to understand what is going on in terms of society. Post-Second World War, Britain struggles and then hits an economic boom, along with most of the rest of the world. Once sort of reconstruction of the devastation of the war in Europe is underway or partially complete, you see a huge economic boom. You see virtually full employment. There's more money. There's more disposable income for people. People have come out of the age of rationing and into the age of affluence. And that brings a sort of different kind of society with it as well. People want to spend money, people want to enjoy themselves. So newspapers like the Sun emerging taps into that kind of affluent optimism in the country.